The health insurance executives combined made $138 million, or 74 times what the charity executives made. But then these are the salaries we get all bent out of shape about in this society. So it's an upside down world to me that values the institutionalization and the affordability of disease 74 times greater than its eradication. The second area that I looked at was advertising and marketing. We give the for-profit sector enormous freedom to spend on advertising. They can spend until the last dollar no longer produces a penny of value. And advertising and marketing are huge academic programs in all of our business schools all over the country. But donors don't like to see their donations spent on paid advertising when it comes to charity. They say, you know, if you can get the advertising donated, that's great. But I don't want to see my donations spent on an ad. You know, I want my money to go to the needy, as if the money spent on the ad is not connected at all to helping the needy. So we have this real imbalance in society. I didn't look at the LA Times this morning, but I'm sure if we opened it, you'd find a full-page ad for Macy's, probably 2 or 3. You'd find a couple of pages for Bloomingdale's, you'd find a page for Singular, you'd find a page for General Motors' latest, low interest offer, but you're not going to find a negative interest offer. But you're not going to find an ad for, a full-page ad for violence against women, or a full-page ad for a cure for breast cancer. I doubt if you'll see a half-page or a quarter-page ad for any of those things. So we go out in the world and we're pummeled with ads for, Botox and Budweiser, but relatively speaking, hardly ever see ads for the great causes of our time. Now, if I told, say, the music industry, you can advertise as much as you want, but I said to the movie industry, you can't advertise. Well, it stands to reason that, people are going to buy a lot more music than they are movies, simply because they'll know more about it. And that's the dynamic that we have going on in the nonprofit sector. A rough estimate puts nonprofit sector advertising spending in 06 at $7.6 billion versus $729 billion for everything else in the economy. When you consider that the nonprofit sector, that the health and human services portion of the nonprofit sector is about 20% of the whole. In other words, if you discount museums and operas and universities and hospitals and just focus on the health and human service charities, the gap gets a lot bigger, and it's about $1.6 billion versus $729 billion. Or another way to think of it is one ad for a health and human services charity for every 479 ads for everything else. Just on a micro level, in 04, Save the Children, the biggest advertiser that I could find, spent $6.4 million on advertising, whereas Entertain the Children here, also known as the Walt Disney Company, spent $2.3 billion on advertising and marketing. And John Kenneth Galbraith wrote extensively about the powerful engines of advertising and marketing, and how in business, first you build the product, and then you build the market. And we're not building markets for the great social causes of our time. Charitable giving has stayed constant at about 2% of GDP over the last 30 years, So the nonprofit sector is not pulling any market share from the for-profit sector. The third area that I looked at was risk-taking for revenue development. So, Paramount can make a $100 million movie that fails. It's considered part of a non-linear business model. They make a bunch of movies. Some of them succeed, some of them fail. More succeed than fail. On that basis, they build a huge business, and they develop powerful learning curves. But I'll tell you from personal experience, if you venture out and do a $5 million charity event that doesn't produce a 65% return in the first 12 months, people want to call the Attorney General and they want to sue you. You're considered immoral, unethical, wasteful, all these other things. So nonprofit organizations, and I see it all the time, are petrified of venturing into any unpredictable, bold, new revenue-generating endeavor for fear that if it fails, they're going to be crucified in the media for the high level of overhead. So they can't develop the kinds of powerful learning curves that the for-profit sector can. The fourth area is related, investment in long-term revenue growth. So Amazon can go for 6 years not returning any profit to investors, and investors understand that there's a longer-term strategy here to build market dominance, and investors give them that freedom. But can you imagine some kind of a charitable endeavor where for 6 years the media were able to report that no money went to the needy because you were interested in some longer-term objective? It simply wouldn't be allowed, because everything in the nonprofit sector is looked at in a 12-month window. What did you achieve in those 12 months? What was your efficiency ratio on the fundraising in those 12 months? Not any longer than that. And the last area is profit itself. So the for-profit sector can pay a financial return to investors in order to attract capital. Nonprofit sector can't. So it's limited to the donation as its only financial instrument. So the for-profit sector monopolizes the multi-trillion-dollar capital markets. So if you put these 5 things together and think about them, no competitive compensation, no ability to do meaningful advertising the way the for-profit sector does, no ability to take anywhere near the kind of risk to generate new revenue that the for-profit sector can, no permission to have a long timeline to develop revenue the way the for-profit sector can, and no capital, no stock market for attracting capital, and you just put the nonprofit sector at really the most unimaginably extreme disadvantage to the for-profit sector, and then we call this whole system charity. Charity could not be undermined with more reverence paid to the notion of charity. So I had a line in the book in the early drafts that said these ideas come from old Puritan constructs, and my agent at the time challenged me and said, how do you know that? And so I spent 6 agonizing months reading books about the early Puritan settlers to New England. And what was interesting about them, there were a lot of things that were interesting about them, but they were very aggressive capitalists. They came here in the 1630s looking for religious freedom, but also all over their journals and their writings, you can see that they were interested in how much money they could make here. But at the same time, they were Calvinists, and Calvin taught that self-interest was a sure path to eternal damnation. So this created a real problem for them. Here they are, all self-interested in coming here to make all this money, but self-interest is a sure path to hell. So charity became this economic sanctuary, this separate economic world, where you could do penance for your profit-making tendencies. And so long as you did charity, you could make as much money as you wanted. In fact, the common theme of the time was that you had to make a lot of money so that you could set aside in case you ever needed to give it to the poor. But of course, nobody ever gave their entire estate to the poor. And we're still kind of stuck with that system today. Self-deprivation hasn't been abandoned as the road to social change. It's pretty much the road still prescribed. So these Puritan ideas and this rule book are policed by this very sinister, very counterproductive question, which is what percentage of my donation goes to the cause versus overhead. And we want the amount going to the cause to be very high and the amount going to overhead to be very low, right? And that's how we're all trained. So there are 3 kind of categories of problems with this question that we've all been trained to ask. And the first is that it makes us think that overhead is not part of the cause. But it absolutely is, unless there's some kind of fraud going on. And if there's fraud going on, nobody's going to report it in line item detail on their charitable form 990. This idea that